Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our very warm, slightly humid evening that we have together under this tent. I know that you have your eyes fixed on tomorrow. Everyone is talking about it. I'm talking about Sunday's election in France. But what we're going to do today is to look not to tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow. And by that I mean not next Monday, but I mean the future, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into the future. This outlook doesn't seem to be something that our politicians are talking about at the moment, but these issues will have a real issue on our future fate rather than the current issues. Research and innovation are fundamental for any nation, so that's what we're going to talk about this evening with a fairly provocative question. Should we privatize research to make it more effective? I've slightly changed the title of the session, but that's what the title is all about. We're going to question the fragile and crucial balance between public sector research, particularly most basic research, and private sector research, the research carried out by businesses that are looking to innovate with their technologies, products and services. So in order to discuss this today, we have just next to me Norah PATTEN, who is a candidate to become an astronaut. She works with Realtra Space Systems Engineering. She's a space engineer, and she is going to soon be looking down on us from somewhere closer to the stars. Next to Norah is Nicolas DUBOURG. You are president of the private equity company ISALT, which is investing significantly in this connection between research and business. Alongside Nicolas, you have Rafaèle TORDJMAN, who chairs another private equity fund called JATO Capital. You also have a background in science, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. Next to Rafaèle, we have Yasmine BELKAID, who is chief executive of the Institut Pasteur. A very long CV you have, and you will be able to share with us your incredible experience in this field. But before we hear from any of these speakers, we're going to hear from Ariel MENDEZ, who is a professor in management at Aix-Marseille University and is member of the Cercle des Économistes. She is going to set the discussion in context. There's a lot of preconceptions that fly around with respect to the state of research in France. So, Ariel, where are things at in France right now? Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, everybody. Why are we asking this question about privatizing research to mutualize innovation? This question is indeed a little bit provocative, as Philippe said, but it highlights the ongoing stereotype of academic research, the idea that it is focused on things that are distant from the world of business. Is that true? Obviously, the two key roles of universities are teaching and research, but for several decades we've added a third one, which is focusing on innovation, and over the last 20 years governments have focused on enhancing this third mission through different reforms. I'll just mention a few of them. There's a law on the freedom and responsibility of universities voted in 2007, and laws that voted the future investments and a number of other reforms that followed on from that. All of these reforms led to closer relationships between private sector and public sector research, but perhaps a closer relationship in the way they work. There are project methods where teams are in competition together, but when you look at the different budgets, the public sector organizations like CNRS and INRIA in France and the universities, we can see that the resources coming from the National Research Agency and European programs represent quite a high level. 25% of projects for private sector finance only represents 5% of the projects. Could we go further? Yes, I think we should we do more, and can we go further? Before I answer that, I'll give you a few figures. The domestic spending on research and development on France in 2022 was 57 billion euros, 2.8% of the GDP. Private businesses represent about 68%, 36 billion euros. And about 9 to 10% of this is publicly funded through tax credits for research. Businesses employ 71% of researchers against 61% against 39% in universities. So the private sector is ahead in terms of research, but innovation still requires public research funding. And I would say there's three reasons for this. Firstly, fundamental public research, and I do make the distinction between the fundamental research that happens in the public and the private sector, because there is fundamental research in the private sector. Public fundamental research is key. The sociologist Michael Callon said how important it is to consider science as a public good, which enables us to act in the long term and in the public interest. Secondly, research funding is essential because it bears some of the risk that businesses can't bear because of their economic constraints. A third reason for this is that public funding has a positive impact on the level and quality of business R&D. We know that the businesses that capitalize the most on public research are those that also invest the most in their own R&D. The key issue for innovation is public-private cooperation. From this perspective, France is facing two challenges, or perhaps two weaknesses. Firstly, as a country, we are not investing enough in research. As I said just a bit earlier, just over 2% in GDP, which is below the European average. Germany, Belgium, Switzerland are about 3% of GDP, so that's a much higher level. And despite all of the different mechanisms and schemes that have been put in place, the lack of cooperation between public sector and private sector is a reality. Why is that? There's a bit of a cultural gap between public sector and private sector research. There are different goals, different timescales as well between basic research, fundamental research, which requires a long time scale, and private sector research, which is looking for quick results, quick wins. So the aim is to build and strengthen the bridge by improving mobility of researchers between public and private organizations and create the conditions for mutual enrichment in order to benefit society as a whole. In order to do that, we need to ensure academic freedom, independent production of original knowledge, but we also need to protect intellectual and industrial property rights, and in more general we need to support businesses' innovation functions in order to collaborate with public sector research. Thank you very much. Ariel. Ariel MENDEZ, thank you. One of the things we should note from that is that 2/3 of research is private sector, 1/3 public sector, both in terms of staffing and in terms of financial resourcing, and that Europe isn't ahead of the game and France is lagging behind within Europe. So all of that creates a context which is a bit of a challenge. So let's start by getting into the detail of this issue with someone who is very important in terms of French research schemes. She's important both through her experience. I'm referring to Yasmine BELKAID. You have a very international background. You are French and Algerian. You've spent a lot of time in your career in the USA. You are a well-known researcher in the field of immunology. You've led a very significant laboratory in the US, and you are continuing to carry out research at the Pasteur Institute whilst still leading the organization. And finally, as I'm sure you're going to explain to us, the Pasteur Institute is a very unique institution. There are other institution, but this one is perhaps a bit of a one-off within the field of French innovation. So the COVID pandemic highlighted, as we will remember, how far France was behind in terms of vaccine production and vaccine research. We saw that the innovation came from Germany with BioNTech and the UK with the Oxford vaccine. You've come in to lead the organisation just a few months ago. What would your first observation be? Is French innovation and research struggling? Yes, I think that French research is struggling. Let me mention a couple of things when we talk about this sector. We are all coming from education which was paid for by the government. Let's not forget that. All of those who were working in research are coming from a system that was publicly funded. Let's remember that. It's an important point. French research is struggling, and for various reasons. What happened with COVID was one thing that reminded us of this fact. We know there's low levels, chronically low levels of funding for research, and particularly for biomedical research. Fell in terms of funding by 30% in the decade before COVID, so we're very badly prepared. What happens? We see our scientists leave the country and go to work abroad. The lack of resources means that the system is less competitive. And in a system where you needed to react quickly in the COVID pandemic, we needed a network and a partnership with industry, and that had dissipated. So we're in a perfect storm. We were less well placed to respond to the situation that's occurred. You have a very international background. As I said, you led one of the major laboratories, the National Institute of Health, the NIH, an American body, which has a budget of more than $50 billion per year. Here in France, we struggle to understand how massive the organization is. And this organization is at the heart of basic fundamental research. What do they have that we don't? Is it money, talent? Well, one thing in the USA that is very different is that there is a strong belief in the power of research. It's an incredible system because regardless of the political context, something that unites all Americans is the deep-seated belief that academic research will give very significant benefits to society. That's very much a shared belief. So the fact that NIH spends money in all of the states and all the states benefit from it, they all become advocates for this type of system. There's another thing about the deep-seated belief in investment in public sector research. There is a form of optimism, belief in a positive future, and readiness to respond quickly. There's also a lot of philanthropy, which reduces some of the risk of research, and that creates an environment which is very highly supported by the government. It's very stable, so it enables there to be an ecosystem where research can be produced, and it enables long-term partnerships to be created. The business and industry sector benefits from this public research. Where do these $50 million come from? From taxation. This is a societal choice to reinvest, to invest. Is this the state federal budget, the federal budget? Yes. That's very impressive. Rafaèle TORDJMAN, you've been a researcher in a past life in the health and medical sector before you moved into private equity sector. I'm not going to call it venture capital. It's private equity, which is the step that comes after the venture capital stage. So you're not focusing on the earliest stages of business creation. Do you agree with what has been said about this difficult situation that French research faces? Is it about the poor connection between the public and private sector? You've worked in hospitals, you've worked in medical laboratories, you know this area, but over the last 20 years you've been investing in private equity. Is there a difficulty in the connection between these two worlds? First thing I'd like to say is thank you to the organisers. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, there is a problem in terms of the connection and there need to be some improvements. But what I'd like to do is talk about health and innovation in health. That's as a physician and biological research I can speak into. We talked about COVID and you said that we were very much behind when COVID hit. COVID highlighted that health is a public good and we had perhaps forgotten that a bit rapidly. So it shows that we all need to make efforts, whether it's in finance, where I'm working now, or in terms of public or in private financed research. I think this is very important. Otherwise, there will be no more economy. With the G2 private equity fund and in the health sector in France and abroad, one of the key things that we see after fundamental research, and when I talk about fundamental research, this is research that is not applied research. We might be looking for new targets or new pathways in order to then innovate and carry out the applied research which leads to R&D. This fundamental basic research needs ongoing funding. We should not decline in this way because otherwise we'll have no more research following on for that. And then applied research and R&D is generally increasingly funded by the private sector. The private sector funds startups and funded by private equity funds like us, and our money comes from institutional funds. So this is a huge value chain where both the public and the private sector play a complementary role in different proportions depending on what stage of the chain you're looking at. So when you look at a company, I'll take the example of a French company that we funded called Sparring Vision, which focuses on serious eye diseases that make people blind, and they are using gene therapy. This innovation came out of the Eye Institute in Paris, led by a researcher who'd worked a lot in the USA, and on the basis of his research funded by INSERM, public research body, the innovation was patented, and that's a really key stage. And when you have the patent, then the private sector bodies can come into play to provide funding, but also offer know-how and talent, in particular from the pharmaceutical industry at the other end of the chain, who will be ending up selling and marketing these products. So this is a key step in the chain. Funding is very important. It's not just about seed funding at the start of business light. There's a public investment bank called BPI France, and I mention them very often because they have funded lots of parts of the value chains. But there are other investors like our fund, J2. We manage a fund of 535 million euros in order to push the businesses forward, because you need to ensure continuity. The EIB, where we put together the J2 private equity fund in 2019, their report said that you need to fund not only all the parties, but there need to be funds to ensure continuing finance, because when this finance is available as continuous, you can move forward quicker and quicker to provide benefits for patients. So this is a very important part, and funds like ours, let's perhaps talk about some of the positive things, some of the solutions. We're able to benefit from some significant initiatives in Europe and in France to raise high levels of funding. An economist called Tibi had been appointed by the Le Maire government in France. We raised 6 billion in 2022, 7 billion last year to invest in funds like ours in order to promote private sector R&D with public funds behind it. So in this public-private partnership, there are funds like ours which are very important. Our fund wouldn't exist if we didn't have an investor, this French investment bank, BPI, another organisation called the Caisse des Dépôts, the FEI, which is another public investor. All of this gave us leverage to draw in other private investors like the Texas Pension Fund, Singapore Fund, Capgemini put money into the fund. So all of these public and private sector stakeholders were very important throughout this value chain. Let's go back to the question at the start. Are you seeing an improvement in terms of the public sector researchers and their appetite for working to promote and commercialize their research? We're not talking about making all researchers into the leaders of startup businesses, but you were saying people say there's some cultural barriers in France whereby people who are working in research struggle to get started in building a business or working with private sector business. Are things improving at the moment? Yes, very clearly there was a law voted on innovation, and some researchers have been able to release either some or all of their time to work on business ideas. That's really changed things. When you look at patents are the result of publications that have been transformed into innovation that can be used for industrial manufacturers. France is leading the way in Europe in terms of the number of patents. 20 years ago, when I started in investment, I came from the academic world, and researchers didn't want to file patents. They just wanted to publish papers. So there's been a new interest and a lot of changes. There's a lot has come from this public investment bank, BPI France. But there are other banks as well who've invested in order to push this entrepreneurial spirit. So we have entrepreneurs, researchers who are much more curious about working in the business world. And what we need to improve is the speed at which things go. In institutes, public sector institutes such as INSERM, CNRS, and universities come together to file patents and to commercialize products. It takes a long time when you compare it with what goes on in the USA, and you lose value like that. That's an interesting thing that you say. You just mentioned the I Institute, but the object that you're talking about is very interesting. It's a research institute based inside a public hospital in Paris, but which is carrying out both fundamental research and also research that's going into the private sector. It's a very nice model, actually. It's both public sector, private sector, fundamental research, applied research. There's another nice example of that in France, which is the Imagine Institute for Rare Diseases, where you have patients being treated on one site, where there's also researchers and also businesses working. It's a great example. We need some others as well, and we need people and stakeholders to get together and work in an open innovation approach. We haven't talked about the Pasteur Institute model. It's a combination of public and private sector thanks to its public fundraising. Let's carry on now with Nicolas DUBOURG. You know a bit about science. You said you had a PhD in maths. That's not bad, I'd say. But you've decided to spend your life in the financial sector and help businesses to develop, particularly in high-tech sectors, in mobility, energy, and so on. So you focus on some of those fields. Tell us a little bit about whether it's perhaps easier to work than in the field of healthcare. Are there some sectors where you're particularly focused on because the French market has some specialities in those fields? Tell us what your approach is and talk to us about this relationship of public and private sector in research. Thank you, Philippe. Good afternoon, everybody. I would be fairly optimistic, actually, when I look over the last 30 years. From my point of view, the connection between research and the private sector has moved on. In the past, businesses were asking how they could work with a researcher, how they could hire a researcher. It's no longer the case at all. When you look at the technological parts of our investments, there are very significant connections between public sector laboratories and private businesses that work in similar fields. So I'm not going to talk more about the ecosystem, which Rafaèle described very well. You can have both public and private investment, so from long-term private sector investors in France who are interested in those issues. In our fund, ESALT, we invest in mature companies with high levels of R&D intensity. They often invest more than 10% of their annual revenue, sometimes as much as 15% in R&D. That's a very high level. We're also funding younger and less mature companies which need capital in order to boost their development, scale up and create their industrial facilities or boost sales. So when you're in that kind of world, you have to be quite pragmatic and realistic. You're putting a lot of money in to build production facilities, and you need to make sure that there will be a return on investment and a positive outlook. So to respond to Philippe's question, what we try to do is to look at the overall ecosystem. I know it's a bit of a cliche to talk in these terms, but it is quite meaningful to make sure that an invention that starts with a scientific or technological innovation might have a chance of success here in France. Let me give you an example of a very mature company called Soitec. We are on the board of directors of this company. They make substrates for semiconductors. They come out of a public research laboratory called the CEA in France. They use patents developed by the CEA, and they are staying ahead of their competitors thanks to this partnership. It's a great French business. Recently, we funded Verkor. You might have heard of this business, a battery manufacturer based in northern France near Dunkirk. And once again, we brought together expertise in technology and industrial manufacturing in order to do that. And there is an industrial partnership with the Renault car company. It's very important to have a comprehensive ecosystem to ensure that these innovations would have outlook in France. In the space sector, we provided investment for a company from Rennes. I think it's interesting to note that these companies are right across France, not just in the capital. It's important that science isn't just based in Paris. It needs to create local jobs. That's a key point that we look at. This company has a fleet of observation satellites. It's supported by the French Navy, but also works with other NATO countries and private businesses. It's one particular technological advance over its American competitor, and it's just they've just raised 85 million euros, so that's pretty impressive. And the final example is in the agri-food sector. We have worked with a French agricultural cooperative with patented processes for manufacturing plant-based proteins, and 1,000 farmers have signed up to use this innovative process. That's right across France, right across our territory, with a grassroots approach, which is fairly fundamental to us.
You mentioned Soitec. It's interesting because indeed, when it comes to regions, the Grenoble regions near the Alps is quite exceptional because, well, the CEA, the Nuclear Research Center, has a lab working with businesses, and they also have a large ecosystem. I think it is the part of France where there is the highest number of engineers per square kilometer. So it's very much like the Eye Institute. It's a location where talents gather, and this will lead to a lot of IT companies or microelectronics or the other high-tech corporations. Now, let's conclude this roundtable discussion with you, Norah PATTEN. You are soon you'll be taking off somehow. You'll be lifting off, actually. You've been selected to be involved in Virgin Galactic flight private business, by the way. Note that in space today, between Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and it is Branson, it's private. It is a domain where a lot of private money is being invested. It's not for the sake of it. This is a call for technologies and for research, and it is also something that makes us dream. So, Norah, tell us, explain to us how do you see the role of space research in this discussion between public-private?
Yes, thank you very much. Excusez-moi, I'll speak in English. Yeah, I think the last decade or so has probably been one of the most exciting when we look at space as an industry. Just to put some context on it, there was a recent report by the World Economic Forum that is predicting the global space economic world will reach $1.8 trillion by 2035. So that's a big number, up from about 630 billion as of 2023. Will it reach that number? Who knows? But the point is, it's growing year on year. And what we're seeing is that the return on investment and the return from space is not just financial. More and more space-based technology is helping combat big global issues, for example, climate change, disaster response, all of these big global issues. And you look at the role of government, look at the number of space agencies. So, for example, in the year 2000, we had about 40 space agencies. That number has almost doubled now to over 75. So it gives you some context on the fact that more and more governments are becoming much more active in the sector because they know the benefits isn't just financial, it's also national and, you know, for the greater good. I'd absolutely echo, you know, some of the comments on the panel earlier. I work for a space technology company in Ireland. Absolutely, the role of research in academia, working with small companies is essential. You know, I work for a space technology company. We've very close ties with France through Ariel Group. So the Ariane 6 is Europe's next flagship launcher. It's going to launch on Tuesday evening. For anybody who's interested in space, watch it because it's going to be a big...
We cross fingers.
Cross fingers, I should add that. But, you know, it's been really remarkable for Railtra to be able to work with a very big French space player and have Irish technology on board. And, you know, those systems require innovation. They require financing. And so I look at, you know, my role in Railtra, but also my role as flying as a researcher to space on a commercial suborbital, and where is the role of government in this? And I think it's comultifaceted. You know, the government needs to support the skill set nationally and in Europe. They need to help commercialise the IP, back to what was being said earlier. They need to act as a networker. How do you connect researchers with industry and industry with academia? They need to know what's happening in the various institutions and who needs what. That's absolutely key. I've seen it even with progressing our technology right through the technology readiness level all the way up to flight, you know, operation. You need to map out along that chain what needs to happen. So to have matchmakers is very, very important. And also matchmakers for working with other industries across Europe. That's going to be key as the sector grows and as Europe takes its place in space. You need that network. So I think it's multi-layered.
And when we prepare this roundtable, you told me also that one of the role of space is also to give to the young people the motivation, the envy, the dream, the desire to go to the engineering, science, and it's a big driver for the young people.
I think, yeah, I think a lot of kids would say space and dinosaurs, you know, are their two loves when they're young. But I really think it's been a testament of commercial opportunities. Like a decade ago now, I was able to work with a commercial company called NanoRacks based in the US to send the first Irish student experiment to the space station. And that experiment flew up on the Orb-2, it flew down on SpaceX. Commercial space was really in its infancy at the time, but to make young people aware of those opportunities was just, that's so critical. And I really think it's going to be a huge role to my own spaceflight, is to engage with as many people as possible, to talk about the research, what we're doing, why we're doing it, the benefits to society, and also the commercial opportunities that come out of space. So yeah, I think it's certainly, since my spaceflight has been announced only 2 weeks ago, there's been massive support and enthusiasm and excitement around it nationally.
Alors voilà, c'est important en fait de faire rêver aussi toute une génération pour que.
It's important to make a generation dream so that they will believe in progress in science, technology. It is part of the equation in order to improve the situation. Now, to improve the situation, let's have a roundtable discussion now before taking questions from the audience. Quickly, each and every one of you. What are your recommendations? How can we improve the French system, by the way? Because we've seen that it can be improved, definitely. It needs improvement. Yasmine, BELKAID. We didn't talk about it early on, but the status of a Pasteur Institute is specific. It's a public entity. The board of directors comprises people from research organizations like CNRS and INSERM, but it calls on they receive private donations. Is it a replicable model which is efficient for the future? The reason why I came back to France, because of the Pasteur Institute, because Pasteur Institute is a model which right from the start was very modern, done by Louis Pasteur. The idea was the continuum. Within the same institute, there would be non-directed researchers for curiosity, fundamental research, then applied research, then medicine and innovation. So clearly, in education. So it is an exhaustive understanding, research, everybody under the same roof. This is the way to make headways. And this model, you know, hold on for 140 years, and it remains an amazing and powerful institute in the world, thanks to this very modern, highly modern vision that the ecosystem has to be integrated. So today, this integration shows its limits. We are funded only at 15% by the government. Things are becoming more difficult, and the balance between the four dimensions has to be preserved. That of innovation, you know, the independent fund, and so on and so forth. But I want to say as well that this collaboration, I mean, we have to preserve the space for research. The word has not been mentioned much here. Research for tomorrow's drugs all came from research which were not always direct, so it was fundamental research based on curiosity, which takes time, which has to be protected. This is what the Institut Pasteur fait. You know, we have to keep that in the French ecosystem. The origin of discoveries is curiosity in research. What is revolutionizing the cancer care comes from fundamental research on how immunotherapy, how we respond to ourselves. The CRISPR, you know, which will change this, you know, the molecular scissors, the clippers. You know, someone said, I want to understand how bacteria fights against the virus. So we have to know that this research, which may seem esoteric, is the basis of all fundamental discoveries. So we need to protect this ecosystem in collaboration with to evolve to the industry and partners, but this space is vital, and it's unfortunately becoming too small in France. Well, this space is vital. We need to foster it, yet time has nothing to do with that of businesses. You remember that the first NRA discovery was 40 years ago, artificial intelligence 50 years ago. So clearly there is a maturation laser. I mean, let's look at all the major breakthrough discoveries. They come from all private research. So how can we have in the same location people who work on sort of a timeless agenda and others who have 1, 2, 3 years agenda? Well, let's not stop it. It's a pipeline. It has to be a continuous process. Discovery will mature, grow, and we have to see when there is a discovery and help scientists. But we have to give them time. But if we stop interrupting fundamental research, the pipeline will diminish. We have to give time to time, but we have to look at what is going on, help scientists. Some scientists are, are not necessarily entrepreneurs, but they're good at finding things. So we have to help them and give them resources to so that they can proceed with their information. So research and discovery has to be preserved for its intrinsic value. Let's not turn all researchers into entrepreneurs. It's not necessarily their cup of tea, not the same DNA, if I dare say so. So now, TORDJMAN. So, Madame TORDJMAN, what can we improve? Well, of course, the state has to give more money. Okay, we'll see tomorrow and tomorrow, day after tomorrow, what will go on. But, well, I did like research by curiosity, curiosity-driven research rather than fundamental research. So, well, we need to attract private money and not just the state. And we have to take time, but we help them to go further in their research. And this is clearly the public-private partnership, which I mentioned earlier, but there are others. There are many hidden treasures in France. There is a company we finance from the French Blood Institute in France, in Besançon, with products which can cure leukemia in elderly patients. So a lot of treasures. And again, for this, there are more and more public-private partnerships. There is the, I mentioned, the Saclay for nuclear research, IGR with a collaboration with the pharma industry. All this is important, in fact, to take more risk before it becomes a product. But there is also an innovation aspect we haven't discussed. Well, you mentioned it, artificial intelligence, but now it's the right time with the good opportunity, especially for healthcare. There are so many patient data. Now we're facing regulatory impediments. How can we use data, patient data, without affecting their private life or their intimacy? But we need to generate data which will make it possible to speed up, to produce better drugs, cheaper drugs, but everything which has to do with prevention. So there are, there must be public-private collaboration that are most interesting there. And I think what is also interesting with the Pasteur Institute, and the only one in France, is that it functions. One of the solutions is that universities, foundations should invest themselves into the funds like we do, like ours, so that there will be a virtuous feedback so that they can refinance more innovation. And the third, to me, the third aspect is everything that's philanthropy. I mean, clearly there is a link with and even a virtuous circle, which is to finance with money, to take risk so that afterwards the profit should be put to the benefit of research. There is a great Danish example, the Innovo Foundation, which is for non-profit making actions, but has created several activities within profit actions, Nordisk, by the way, and by associating public-private through philanthropy, and because then it can generate through the private, well, there is sort of a loop, and financed more innovation, including the industrialization of drugs. The scale-up, as we said, but of course the industrialization, especially in France, we're all here to try to do more. Nicolas, why don't you invest in AI? That's a trap. That's a nasty question. Well, we haven't yet invested in AI, but well, it is entering several domains, in which we work. So we're looking at it closely. So AI, well, as you said, Philippe, it has been here for quite a while. It's been here for a while, and therefore it is now present in everyday's life. It is the mix of the works and hardware, which made it possible to do quick calculations, quick computing, and things that could not be done because to iterate for hours or days to get the results of the output. Now it can be done quickly, and the models can be applied. So AI, well, just consider that, again, to finance that, to enter into that, we need a logic of domains and a global ecosystem that will enable younger companies, innovative companies from France and Europe. Well, this is more a European than French debate because a lot of money is needed to have a lasting, profitable future. Let me remind you that versus the US, I made a simple calculation. When you look at the GAFAM and their mean free cash flow in 2023, what they get in cash over a year is 60 billion. It's lots of money on average for each. Now, when we look in France, major corporations, well, you see LVMH Total, their free cash flow on average is 15 billion each. So in the US, you got companies with huge means which are already in the ecosystem, and they can accelerate young companies. So to do this, we need to do it with on a larger play field at the European scale. And this is for the public authorities and the public decisions to support this development. And private investors will not do it. Last point, now, there is a kind of a technological breakthrough or rupture coming from fundamental research, which took 10 years around quantum calculation. We had the Nobel Prize in 2022. Work started in the 70s, so it's concrete now. We now have champions, most interesting to look at that. And with a new disruption, we're less in competition with Chinese or American players, so there could be an opportunity to be taken. Nuclear industry, again, or nuclear domain. I mean, this is accepted. It can be heard. We can look at it. There is a very high know-how. High know-how in France. We know that. There are 12 innovative projects that have been identified, in addition to the traditional projects. Things to be done, capital needed, long-term projects. We have to look into that. Noah.
Will give your opinion on what we can do to improve research in Europe, especially France, of course.
Well, I suppose I can't sit here and not mention the International Space Station. It's a researching laboratory. It's been in operation since November 2000. And to echo what's been said, fundamental research takes time. And it's really quite a remarkable environment when you do research in a microgravity lab. Things behave differently, they grow differently, and they're calling this the decade of science because the astronauts on board are there to do science, to do payloads, to do operations all day, all of their days while they're in space. And I think over the next decade, we'll see an awful lot more outputs from that research. And what I hope is that the commercial suborbital research flights will help augment, will help assist the research in microgravity. Because I was at a recent launch over in New Mexico, and it was really quite remarkable to see the interaction of the research folk on board, how they were able to literally walk their experiments on board the spacecraft very shortly before the launch. This is with Virgin Galactic suborbital. The spacecraft took off, went to space, the research was done on board, and within minutes of the flight landing, the researchers had those experiments back in their hands. So from an end user perspective, the accessibility is important. The cost, the frequency of the launches, all of those things are important, but we've learned so much from living and working on the ISS, on the International Space Station. Next point of life will be to go to the moon. The moon is 1/6 gravity compared to microgravity on the ISS. So again, it's going to be a new place for us to go and learn more about how things operate in that environment. But yeah, I mean, I cannot not mention the ISS as a research platform, and I think there's going to be a whole lot more outputs from it in the next few years.
Okay, so let's go to the moon, but juste avant.
Before that, we have to close this roundtable. We won't have time for questions. So if you have questions, do not hesitate to come and talk to the members of the panel when we'll be out. Ariel, the closing note, 3-4 minutes to tell us what should be, what's the take-home message. I'm not if I'm surprised or astonished. Well, everything has been said, confirmed, a lot of things. First, congratulations for the richness and the quality of your interventions. I can detect a note of optimism. I mean, clearly, we can see that there are solutions, devices, or spaces for integration of the various players, and therefore the stakeholders can work together, so things are not that bad. Nevertheless, I mean, what we have to bear in mind is that there is no innovation without research, especially without fundamental research or research by curiosity. So what I keep in mind as well is that behind the low figures in terms of investment in research, maybe there is a lack of a project and political vision. And I remember what you said early on about the need. Well, we must trust science that works for society. Researchers work for society. They don't work for themselves. And then we have to trust and believe in the future. And Norah talked about dreams. Yeah, of course, science has to fuel dreams. And it is probably one means to restore or to amplify trust in science. And then the state has to accept to take the responsibility for that risk. At the European level, early on, you talked about the means that the GAFAM can have at their disposal. Well, Europe doesn't have that, France certainly not, so we won't be able to do research for innovation and society without the without going to Europe. So that's what I keep in mind. Many other points, but those are the main points and elements. And if you give me 1 minute to conclude, we talked about innovation, but innovation is a kind of sort of a buzzword in our society. And innovation is not always a source of progress. Innovation could be the transformation of an idea into something that will produce value, especially economic value. But we know where we can produce economic value without any societal or social value. So research serves what type of innovation? And then there is a colleague, Frank Ageri in Paris Tech, who wrote a book called Innovation, but to do what? You know, or to what purpose? So always, what's the end purpose of innovation? And a little down note, well, we had great panelists but all in the same domain. But research is also human and social science. We're human beings, we live in society. We know that today we go through institutional, political, democratic, demographic crises, which are essential. We will not innovate in the social, institutional, political plan without human and social science. Research is also human and social science. We need mathematicians and philosophers and sociologists and doctors and interpreters, everything. So thank you all, and good evening.